"My dear Bunter," observed Lord Peter Wimsey, pausing beneath the weathered stone arch of Graydon Abbey to examine a brass plaque with the sort of attention one might reserve for a questionable wine vintage. "Observe the egregious solecism perpetrated by our Victorian forebears. Graydon Abbey, founded 1147 AD. The redundancy is quite painful. Anno Domini already signifies 'in the year of our Lord,' rendering the additional AD as superfluous as a bishop's blessing at a hanging." Bunter, who had long since ceased to be surprised by his master's capacity for discovering grammatical offences in the most unlikely circumstances, merely adjusted his grip on the umbrella as the October rain drummed against the ancient stones with the persistence of a penitent seeking absolution. "Indeed, my lord. Shall I make a note for the Abbey's consideration?" "Good heavens, no. One mustn't deprive the local clergy of their innocent pleasures. Besides," Wimsey added, his pale eyes brightening with amusement, "I suspect we shall find rather more pressing matters to occupy our attention." The invitation had come from Dr. Felix Venn, a collector of medieval manuscripts whose reputation for both scholarly excellence and social eccentricity had preceded him into the drawing rooms of London like the scent of ancient vellum and barely suppressed hysteria. His letter, penned in an archaic hand that suggested either profound learning or theatrical affectation, had requested Wimsey's expertise in authenticating a recently acquired treasure. A 15th-century Book of Hours, executed on black-dyed vellum, a technique so rare and technically demanding that fewer than a dozen examples were known to survive. "The Black Hours of Graydon," Wimsey murmured as they approached the Abbey's main entrance, where a woman of indeterminate middle age awaited them with the sort of expression typically reserved for tax collectors and other necessary evils. "Rather melodramatic, don't you think? Though I confess the prospect of examining lamp-black vellum is sufficiently enticing to overlook Dr. Venn's apparent fondness for Gothic nomenclature." The woman, Miss Morley, as she introduced herself with crisp efficiency, possessed the demeanor of someone who had spent years organizing other people's enthusiasms into manageable categories. Her grey dress matched her disposition, and her manner of speaking suggested a profound suspicion of anything that might disturb the careful order of her world. "Dr. Venn is waiting in the long library," she announced, leading them through a flagged hall where the shadows seemed to pool like spilled ink. "He has been quite beside himself with anticipation since your letter arrived. I do hope you will find the manuscript worthy of your attention. He has spoken of little else for weeks." The long library stretched the length of the Abbey's south wing, its mullioned windows offering a view of gardens where yew trees stood like hooded sentinels in the grey afternoon light. The air carried the familiar perfume of old leather and beeswax, tinged with something faintly medicinal that Wimsey's experienced nose identified as the vinegar-based solutions used in manuscript preservation. Dr. Venn himself proved to be a spare, energetic man whose hands moved with the reverent precision of a priest handling sacred relics. His hair, the color of tarnished brass, had retreated strategically from his forehead, and his eyes held the slightly fevered gleam of the true collector, that peculiar mixture of avarice and aesthetic passion that transforms mere objects into objects of worship. "Lord Peter, at last." He advanced with outstretched hands, as if greeting a fellow conspirator. "You must see it immediately. The hours are beyond anything I dared hope. The preservation is extraordinary, the illuminations intact, the binding original. But come, let the manuscript speak for itself." At the library's center, a glass-topped display case held what appeared at first glance to be a rectangle of midnight itself. The black vellum seemed to absorb the grey afternoon light, creating an effect both beautiful and slightly unsettling, as if one were gazing into a pool of dark water in which golden fish swam among silver reeds. 15th century, Venn breathed, his voice dropping to the whisper appropriate to sacred spaces. French or possibly Flemish workmanship. The technique of dyeing vellum black was enormously difficult. Lamp black mixed with gall, then burnished to this extraordinary finish. Observe the silver lettering, the gold rubrics, the miniature grotesques in the margins. Here, a fox in clerical robes. There, a demon playing chess with a saint. The medieval mind at its most sublimely irreverent. Wimsey studied the open pages with the absorbed attention of a scholar, his monocle catching the light as he leaned closer. The craftsmanship was indeed extraordinary, each letter formed with mathematical precision, each illuminated capital a tiny masterpiece of color and design. Yet something about the manuscript's presentation struck him as odd, though he could not immediately identify the source of his unease. "Remarkable," he murmured. "And the provenance?" A slight shadow crossed Ven's features. "Ah, yes, rather complicated, I'm afraid. It came through Spedwell. You know Spedwell, the dealer in Bloomsbury, part of the Fairfax Mortimer estate. The old colonel had rather eccentric tastes, collected manuscripts with alleged supernatural associations. Complete nonsense, of course, but it does add a certain romantic cachet to the pieces. And a certain premium to the price, no doubt," observed a new voice from the doorway. The speaker was a woman of perhaps 40, possessed of that particular type of beauty that improves with age like a fine wine, her dark hair elegantly arranged, her sapphire brooch catching the light as she moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to being observed with admiration. "My wife Isolde," Ven said, with the slightly strained courtesy of a man whose domestic and scholarly lives existed in careful separation. "Isolde, Lord Peter Wimsey, the expert I mentioned." Mrs. Ven extended a gloved hand with a smile that suggested both genuine warmth and carefully controlled amusement. "Felix has spoken of nothing but black vellum and medieval scribes for weeks, Lord Peter. I do hope you'll find the manuscript sufficiently fascinating to justify his enthusiasm and his expenditure." Before Wimsey could respond, the library door opened again to admit a small procession of additional figures. Dr. Pennington, the village physician, entered with the measured tread of a man accustomed to bringing either healing or bad news, his medical bag in one hand, and an expression of professional skepticism on his weathered features. Behind him came Julian Ven, the collector's nephew, a young man whose carefully cultivated air of aesthetic languor failed to entirely conceal a sharp intelligence and what Wimsey's experienced eye recognized as barely suppressed resentment. "Uncle Felix," Julian drawled, approaching the display case with studied nonchalance. "Still playing with your pretty pictures, I see. Though I must say, this one is rather more cheerful than your usual acquisitions. All that lovely black, so seasonal for autumn." Julian has no appreciation for scholarly pursuits, Mrs. Ven observed with fond exasperation. "He prefers his art to be modern and preferably shocking." "I prefer my art to be profitable," Julian corrected with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Though I suppose there's something to be said for manuscripts that appreciate in value while one sleeps. Rather more reliable than the stock exchange, wouldn't you say, Lord Peter?" Wimsey was spared the necessity of responding by the arrival of the final member of their small gathering, Mr. Spedwell himself, the dealer who had procured the black hours for Ven's collection. He was a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and the perpetually harried expression of someone who spent his days navigating between the competing demands of scholarly authenticity and commercial necessity. "Dr. Ven," Spedwell said, his voice carrying a note of barely concealed anxiety. "I trust everything remains satisfactory with the manuscript. No questions about the attribution or condition?" "None whatsoever," Ven replied, though Wimsey noted a certain coolness in his tone. "The piece is exactly as represented, though I confess I remain curious about the colonel's notes. You mentioned there were papers relating to the manuscript's history?" Spedwell's discomfort became more pronounced. "Ah, yes, rather fragmentary, I'm afraid. The colonel's filing system was unconventional. But I did manage to preserve this." He produced a yellowed envelope from his briefcase. "Found it tucked inside the manuscript's protective case. Probably nothing of significance, but you did ask for any associated documentation." Venn accepted the envelope with obvious eagerness, but before he could examine its contents, a sound from somewhere in the abbey's depths made them all pause. The slow, deliberate tolling of a bell, its bronze voice carrying a note of warning that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the ancient building. "The chapel bell," Miss Morley said, her voice sharp with annoyance. "I've told Rook repeatedly that the mechanism is faulty. It rings at the most inappropriate moments." "Rook?" Wimsey inquired. "The butler," Dr. Pennington explained. "Been with the Abbey for 30 years, man and boy. Knows every stone and timber of the place, though I must say that bell has been acting strangely of late, ringing at odd hours, sometimes in patterns that seem almost deliberate. The village folk have their own theories," Julian added with malicious amusement. "They say the bell tolls whenever sacrilege is committed within the Abbey walls. Rather Gothic, don't you think? Though I suppose it would have been ringing constantly during the dissolution." Mrs. Venn laughed, a sound like silver bells in a minor key. "How delightfully medieval, though I do hope we're not planning any acts of sacrilege this afternoon. I've only just had this dress cleaned." The bell tolled once more and fell silent, leaving behind a silence that seemed somehow expectant. Wimsey, who had been observing the assembled company with the detached interest of a naturalist studying exotic specimens, noticed that each person had reacted to the sound differently. Venn with scholarly irritation, Miss Morley with practical annoyance, Dr. Pennington with medical skepticism, Julian with amused cynicism, Mrs. Venn with elegant dismissal, and Spedwell with what appeared to be genuine unease. "Perhaps," Wimsey suggested with deceptive mildness, "we might examine the manuscript more closely. I confess myself particularly interested in the binding." "Original," you said. As the group gathered around the display case, none of them noticed that the afternoon light had begun to fade with unusual rapidity, or that the shadows in the long library had deepened to an almost tangible darkness. The black hours lay open beneath its protective glass, its golden illuminations seeming to glow with their own inner light, while somewhere in the Abbey's ancient stones, the silence waited with the patience of centuries. And in that silence, Lord Peter Wimsey began to sense the first faint stirrings of something that was not quite mystery, not quite menace, but partook of both. Something that would soon transform this gathering of scholars and aesthetes into something far more dangerous and considerably more interesting. The game, as he was fond of saying, was afoot. Dr. Venn approached the yellowed envelope with the reverent precision of a surgeon making his first incision, while Wimsey observed the assembled company with the detached interest of a naturalist studying particularly exotic specimens. The envelope yielded its contents reluctantly, a brittle sheet of notepaper bearing hasty pencil marks, and beneath it a fragment of what appeared to be medieval vellum, darkened with age and torn along one edge. "Curious," murmured Venn, adjusting his spectacles. "The Colonel's handwriting, certainly, but these notations—" He held the paper toward the lamplight. "Times, dates, and here, bell tolls at 2:10, 4:30, again at midnight. And this Latin inscription in a different hand entirely." Wimsey accepted the paper with the casual authority of one accustomed to having interesting documents placed in his possession. "Noli tangere librum in vigilis," he read aloud, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Though I fear the good Colonel's grasp of Latin grammar was rather more enthusiastic than accurate. The construction suggests do not touch the book during the watches, though a proper classicist would have managed the accusative case with rather more precision." The Colonel was military, not clerical, Mrs. Venn observed with gentle amusement from her position near the window. Perhaps his Latin was learned in the field rather than the classroom. Indeed, Wimsey agreed pleasantly, though one might wonder why a military man would choose to inscribe warnings in ecclesiastical Latin on his manuscript collection. Rather like posting sentries in evening dress, technically possible, but somewhat impractical. Julian Venn, who had been examining the vellum fragment with the languid attention of someone perpetually disappointed by reality, looked up with sudden interest. "Uncle Felix, this isn't merely a note. It's a piece of the manuscript itself. Look here, traces of silver lettering and the edge where it's been cut." He held it delicately toward the light. "Someone has deliberately removed this from the black hours." The observation fell into the library's gathering shadows, like a stone into still water. Spedwell made a small, involuntary sound of distress, while Miss Morley's expression tightened with the particular disapproval reserved for deliberate damage to valuable property. "Impossible," Venn protested, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. "The manuscript is complete. I examined every gathering myself when it arrived." "Perhaps," Wimsey suggested with deceptive mildness, "we might verify that assumption? I confess myself curious about the binding. Original work often reveals its secrets under closer examination." Miss Morley produced her ring of keys with the resigned efficiency of someone accustomed to scholarly emergencies, and the glass case was opened once more. As Wimsey bent over the black hours, his trained eye immediately detected what casual observation had missed: the almost imperceptible gap where a vellum leaf had been skillfully removed, the binding threads carefully rewoven to conceal the surgery. "Ah," he murmured, producing a jeweler's loop from his waistcoat. "Our medieval scribe has been subjected to rather modern editing. The removal was done by someone with considerable skill. Note how the sewing has been matched, the spine carefully restored. Professional work, I should say." "But why?" Mrs. Venn asked, though her tone suggested she was not entirely certain she wished to know the answer. Before anyone could respond, the chapel bell began to toll again, not the random clanging Miss Morley had described, but a measured sequence that seemed to count with deliberate precision. 7 strokes, then silence, then 7 again. "4:15, announced Miss Morley, consulting her watch with the authority of someone who had made punctuality a personal crusade. "Though the bell insists it's 7 o'clock. The mechanism has grown increasingly unreliable since—" She paused, her sentence hanging unfinished in the air like incense in an empty church. "Since when?" Wimsey inquired with gentle persistence. "Since Mr. Hawker arrived to work on the manuscript," she admitted reluctantly. "The conservator Dr. Venn employed, a competent man, I'm sure, but his presence seemed to disturb the Abbey's usual rhythms." Wimsey's pale eyes sharpened with interest. "Disturb them in what particular way?" "The bell began its irregular tolling," Dr. Pennington supplied from his position near the fireplace. "Rook complained that the rope mechanism was behaving strangely, sometimes loose when it should be taut, sometimes pulling of its own accord, and there were sounds." "Sounds?" "In the walls," Miss Morley said with obvious reluctance. "Scratching, rustling, as though something were moving within the stones themselves. Rook insisted it was merely the autumn settling of old timbers, but you remained unconvinced," Wimsey finished gently. "How long was Mr. Hawker in residence?" 3 days, Venn replied, his scholarly composure beginning to show strain. "He arrived Tuesday morning, worked steadily on the manuscript's conservation, and departed Friday afternoon. His methods were entirely conventional: cleaning, stabilization, minor repairs to the binding. And during those 3 days, the bell tolled at irregular intervals," Wimsey mused, glancing again at the Colonel's penciled notes, "including, if I read these notations correctly, at precisely 2:10 and 4:30, the same times recorded in our military Latin scholars' observations." The implications of this observation settled over the assembled company, like a shroud. Spedwell had gone quite pale, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his briefcase, while Julian's expression had shifted from languid amusement to something approaching genuine concern. "You're suggesting," Mrs. Venn said carefully, "that there's some connection between the manuscript and the bell's behavior? That's rather Gothic," Wimsey supplied with a slight smile. "Indeed, It does strain the bounds of rational explanation, though I've found that seemingly supernatural phenomena often yield to more prosaic analysis when examined with sufficient attention to detail. At that moment, Rook appeared in the doorway with the silent efficiency that seemed to be his particular talent. His weathered face bore its customary expression of dignified reserve, though Wimsey noted a certain tension around the butler's eyes that suggested more than routine concern. "Begging your pardon, Dr. Venn," Rook said in his measured baritone, "but Inspector Grayson has telephoned from the village. He requests your immediate presence at Blackwood House. There's been what he termed a development regarding Mr. Blackwood's effects." "A development?" Venn's voice carried a note of alarm. "What sort of development?" "The inspector didn't specify, sir, merely that your expertise in manuscript authentication might prove valuable. He mentioned something about a discovery in Mr. Blackwood's study, papers that may require scholarly evaluation." Wimsey's attention sharpened like a blade finding its edge. "Thomas Blackwood? Would that be the gentleman whose recent demise Dr. Pennington mentioned? The collector of ecclesiastical items?" "The same," Dr. Pennington confirmed grimly. "Found dead in his study 3 weeks ago, under circumstances the coroner deemed ambiguous. No clear cause of death, no signs of violence, yet a healthy man of 35 doesn't simply expire without reason." "And now the inspector requires expertise in manuscript authentication," Wimsey observed thoughtfully. "One might almost suspect that Mr. Blackwood's collection contained items of particular interest, perhaps even items related to our own medieval treasure." The question hung in the air like a challenge, while outside the library windows, the October dusk deepened toward full darkness. The chapel bell had fallen silent, but its absence seemed somehow more ominous than its irregular tolling, as though the abbey itself were holding its breath in anticipation of whatever revelation awaited in the village. "I should go immediately," Venn said, though his reluctance was evident. "Though I confess I'm loath to leave the black hours unattended, given these recent irregularities." "Perhaps," Wimsey suggested with characteristic urbanity, "Bunter and I might remain to keep vigil over your treasure. I find myself increasingly curious about the relationship between medieval manuscripts and modern mysteries. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "someone should be present to observe whether the bell continues its nocturnal commentary in your absence." As Dr. Venn gathered his coat and prepared to depart for the village, none of the assembled company noticed that the shadows in the long library had begun to move with a subtle restlessness, or that the air itself seemed to carry a faint whisper of something that might have been wind, or voices, or merely the ancient stones of Graydon Abbey settling into another night of secrets and silence. The game, Lord Peter reflected with quiet satisfaction, was becoming considerably more interesting than a simple matter of manuscript authentication. And in the darkness beyond the mullioned windows, something that might have been an echo of medieval bells began to toll with the patience of centuries and the persistence of truth itself. The departure of Dr. Venn left behind a curious vacuum in the long library's atmosphere, as though the removal of scholarly authority had somehow diminished the room's gravitational pull. Mrs. Venn settled herself in a wing-back chair with the graceful resignation of someone accustomed to her husband's sudden scholarly emergencies, while Julian resumed his restless perambulation among the bookshelves with renewed energy, as if his uncle's absence had lifted some invisible restraint upon his movements. "Rather convenient timing for Inspector Grayson's summons," Wimsey observed with deceptive mildness, his pale eyes taking inventory of the remaining company. "One might almost suspect that dead collectors possess an inconvenient habit of leaving behind precisely the sort of documentation that living scholars find most disturbing." Spedwell, who had been hovering near the display case with the nervous energy of a man contemplating flight, started visibly at this observation. "I'm sure there's nothing in Mr. Blackwood's papers that could possibly, that is to say, any connection between his collection and Dr. Venn's would be purely coincidental." "Purely coincidental," Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. Rather like the coincidence of lampblack appearing on bell ropes and silver flakes adhering to tarred hemp. Bunter, I believe a closer examination of our Abbey's acoustic properties might prove illuminating. They proceeded to the chapel through corridors that seemed to grow progressively colder as they moved away from the library's warmth. The ancient stones breathed with the accumulated chill of centuries, and somewhere within the walls came that persistent scratching sound, methodical, purposeful, as though something were tracing the building's hidden arteries with infinite patience. In the chapel itself, Rook awaited them with 2 oil lamps that cast wavering circles of honeyed light across the worn flagstones. The bell rope hung through its oaken guide, innocent as a hangman's noose, while above them the bronze voice waited in its tower like a metallic oracle. "Now then, Rook," Wimsey said, producing his jeweler's loupe with the ceremony of a priest unveiling a relic, "let us examine the evidence of our nocturnal campanologist. This chalk mark you mentioned, show me precisely where the rope falls when pulled." Rook indicated a neat cross within a circle, marked on the stone floor directly beneath the rope's natural hang. "When she's pulled proper-like, my lord, the rope throws to here." He gestured to a point some 3 feet from the mark. "But these past weeks, she's been landing closer, sometimes right atop the cross, as if barely pulled at all." Wimsey knelt beside the chalk mark, his loupe catching the lamplight as he examined the worn flagstones. "Ah, and these impressions in the stone dust. Recent, I should say. The outline of a narrow sole, and here..." He indicated a series of small, dark spots leading away from the rope toward the vestry door. "Drops of something." Bunter materialized beside him with a small vial and tweezers, collecting samples with the methodical precision of a naturalist. "Lampblack, my lord, mixed with what appears to be a binding agent, and traces of silver, very fine particles as though scraped from a metallic surface." "Silver," Mrs. Venn repeated, her voice carrying a note of unease. "But surely that's impossible. The bell rope is hemp and tar. There's no silver in its construction." "Indeed not," Wimsey agreed, rising and dusting his knees with characteristic fastidiousness, "which suggests that our mysterious bell ringer brought the silver with them, perhaps on their person, or more likely, on their hands after handling something decorated with silver leaf or paint." The implications of this observation settled over the small group like a shroud. Julian, who had been examining the chapel's Norman architecture with studied nonchalance, suddenly looked up with sharp attention. "You're suggesting someone has been ringing the bell after handling the manuscript, but that's absurd. The library is locked at night, and Miss Morley keeps the only keys." "Miss Morley keeps keys," Wimsey corrected gently. "But keys, like manuscripts, have a curious tendency to multiply when valuable objects are concerned. Tell me, Rook, during Mr. Hawker's residence, did you ever observe him in the chapel during unconventional hours?" The butler's weathered features remained impassive, but Wimsey detected the slightest hesitation before he replied. "Mr. Hawker was a scholar, my lord. His concerns were with books, not bells, though I did notice he showed considerable interest in the Abbey's construction, asked detailed questions about the passages connecting the various buildings, particularly those leading to and from the chapel." "Passages," Wimsey mused. "How very medieval. And the acoustics, Rook. You mentioned that sound carries remarkably well through these old stones." "Aye, my lord. A whisper in the chapel can be heard clear to the library on a still night. The builders knew their business. Sound travels along the stone corridors like water through pipes." At that moment, as if summoned by their discussion, the bell above them gave a single experimental toll. Not the full-throated peal of a properly rung bell, but a muffled, hesitant sound, as though the clapper had struck something softer than bronze. "Fascinating," Wimsey observed, his head tilted in an attitude of concentrated listening. The rope didn't move, yet the bell spoke. "Bunter, would you be so good as to examine the bell chamber?" I suspect we may find that our campanological mystery has a perfectly rational, if somewhat ingenious explanation. While Bunter disappeared up the narrow stone stairs leading to the bell tower, Wimsey continued his examination of the chapel floor. The lamplight revealed additional traces of the mysterious visitor: scuff marks on the ancient stones, a faint smear of something dark on the vestry door handle, and most tellingly, a small piece of black thread caught on a splinter of the rope guide. "Black thread," he murmured, holding it to the light. "Fine quality, possibly silk. The sort used in expensive garments, or perhaps in the binding of valuable manuscripts." Mrs. Venn had grown noticeably paler during these revelations, her elegant composure beginning to show strain. "Lord Peter, surely you don't suspect that someone in our household—" She was interrupted by Bunter's return from the bell chamber, his usually imperturbable features showing signs of genuine interest. "Most illuminating, my lord. The bell mechanism has been modified. Someone has attached a length of fine wire to the clapper, running it down through a crack in the stonework. The wire could be manipulated from below to produce the muffled tolling we observed." "A wire," Wimsey repeated with satisfaction. "How delightfully practical. Our ghost reveals itself to be an engineer, or at least someone with a working knowledge of simple mechanics. And this wire, Bunter, does it lead anywhere in particular?" "Indeed, my lord. It appears to run through the wall cavity toward the library wing. I suspect it emerges somewhere in the vicinity of the manuscript collection." The revelation hung in the chapel air like incense, heavy with implication. Julian had ceased his architectural observations entirely, his attention now focused on Wimsey with the sharp interest of someone who had suddenly realized the game had changed. Spedwell appeared to be calculating the distance to the nearest exit, while Mrs. Venn maintained her composure through what was clearly considerable effort. Before anyone could respond to Bunter's discovery, the sound of an approaching motor car reached them through the chapel's thick walls. Rook, with his uncanny ability to anticipate household needs, appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Venn has returned, my lord," he announced. "Inspector Grayson accompanies him. They request your immediate presence in the library." As they made their way back through the Abbey's corridors, Wimsey reflected on the evening's revelations with quiet satisfaction. The mystery was beginning to reveal its underlying structure, not supernatural intervention, but human ingenuity applied to creating the appearance of supernatural phenomena. The question that remained was why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to create the illusion of a haunted manuscript, and what they hoped to achieve by their nocturnal, campanological performances. In the library, Dr. Venn awaited them with barely contained agitation, while Inspector Grayson, a solid, practical man whose skeptical expression suggested he had little patience for scholarly mysteries, stood examining the black hours with the air of someone confronting evidence he would prefer not to believe. "Lord Peter," Venn began without preamble, "the inspector has made the most extraordinary discovery. Blackwood's study contained a notebook, detailed observations of bell-tolling patterns, times, frequencies, and more disturbing still, a receipt from Spedwell's firm for what he terms manuscript fragments, provenance uncertain." Inspector Grayson looked up from his examination of the display case, his weathered features grim. "There's also this, Lord Peter, found tucked inside Blackwood's desk blotter." He produced a small piece of black vellum, similar to the fragment from the colonel's envelope, but bearing different markings. Dr. Venn confirms it's genuine medieval work, but not from his manuscript, which raises the question of how many pieces of this particular puzzle are scattered about the countryside. Wimsey accepted the fragment with a reverent care due to evidence, examining it through his loupe with characteristic thoroughness. "Indeed. And Mr. Blackwood's notebook, did it contain any observations beyond bell tolling?" "Telephone records," Grayson replied grimly. "Calls made to this abbey at precisely the times recorded for the bell's irregular behavior. Someone was coordinating these nocturnal performances, Lord Peter. The question is who and why?" As if in response to the inspector's words, the chapel bell began its familiar sequence. 7 strokes, a pause, then 7 again. But this time, Wimsey was watching the assembled company with the focused attention of a naturalist observing specimens under glass. And in that watching, he began to discern the first faint outlines of a pattern that would soon resolve itself into something far more complex and considerably more dangerous than a simple case of manuscript forgery. The game, as he was increasingly fond of observing, was growing more interesting by the moment. The 7 tolls of the chapel bell died away into the long library's gathering shadows, leaving behind a silence that seemed to pulse with unspoken accusations. Wimsey, who had been observing the assembled company with the detached interest of a naturalist studying exotic specimens, noted how each person's reaction to the measured bronze summons revealed layers of knowledge they had not previously disclosed. Mrs. Venn's fingers had tightened almost imperceptibly on her sapphire brooch, while a faint smudge along the edge of her glove caught the lamplight, a trace of something dark that might have been lampblack. Julian's studied nonchalance had faltered for the briefest moment, his hands withdrawing from his pockets with an air of injured innocence that suggested they had been engaged in some unconscious, guilty gesture. Spedwell clutched his briefcase until his knuckles went pale, while Miss Morley's competent fingers moved instinctively to close a window against a draught that did not exist. Rather punctual, our phantom campanologist, Wimsey observed with deceptive mildness, wandering toward the long bookcases as though seeking a novel to pass the evening. 7 tolls at 7:15 by Miss Morley's excellent timepiece. One might almost suspect an appointment has been kept. Inspector, you mentioned telephone records from the late Mr. Blackwood's residence. Might I inquire whether those calls followed some particular pattern? Inspector Grayson consulted his notebook with methodical precision. Tuesday through Thursday of last week. Calls placed at precisely 2:10, 4:30, and 7:15 each day. Duration never more than 30 seconds, sometimes as brief as 10, just long enough to ring twice and disconnect. Signal calls, Wimsey murmured, his attention apparently focused on examining the oak paneling along the inner wall. The woodwork was 17th century craftsmanship, with a later Georgian addition skirting the base where some ancestor with a taste for symmetry had bullied the abbey's Gothic irregularities into conformity. His fingers traced the carved beading with lover's precision, pausing at a rosette position to level with the 3rd shelf from the manuscript case. "Rook," he said pleasantly, "might I trouble you for a footman's steadiness and a small screwdriver? I believe our mechanical mystery may yield to more prosaic investigation than spectral intervention would suggest." The rosette yielded to gentle pressure with a barely audible click, and something stirred behind the ancient wood, a tremor as though some wire had been disturbed in its mechanical slumber. Bunter, materializing at his master's side with uncanny prescience, knelt and directed his pocket lamp at what appeared to be a mouse hole that had never been intended for mice. "Fine steel wire, my lord," Bunter reported with quiet satisfaction. "Blackened to avoid detection, entering at a calculated angle. The tension suggests a return mechanism above. Quite ingenious, actually." Inspector Grayson descended to examine the discovery with the reluctance of a man built for more straightforward forms of inquiry. "You're telling me someone's rigged the chapel bell to ring from the library?" "Not rigged, Inspector. Supplemented," Wimsey corrected with evident pleasure in the distinction. "The blessed mechanism remains unmolested. Merely a parallel system has been installed, allowing those of nervous disposition to be suitably harrowed at convenient moments. Bunter, would you be so good as to test our theory? 2 gentle tugs, if you please." The response was immediate and gratifying, a soft, muffled toll from the chapel, followed after precisely the interval required for a spring mechanism to reset by a second, fainter echo. Grayson rose with an oath that was, at least, honest English. "The bottom panel, I think, Rook," Wimsey continued with the air of a man requesting afternoon tea. "I fancy we shall discover the sort of clockwork ingenuity that would do credit to a Swiss artisan." The panel surrendered with a dry gasp, revealing exactly what Wimsey had predicted. A neat arrangement of wire wound upon a wooden bobbin, the steel running through a felt-lined guide and connected to a spring mechanism that had, in some previous existence, probably operated a desk lid. Bunter's lamp illuminated a smear of lampblack on the felt padding and caught beneath the head of a small brad, a single hair of black silk. "Used sparingly and reset with considerable skill," Wimsey observed. "Note the polished groove in the guide. This device has seen regular employment. Our engineer thinks like a clockmaker, Inspector, with an appreciation for both precision and theatrical effect." During these mechanical revelations, Miss Morley had been standing near the window with an expression of someone wrestling with conflicting loyalties. Now she cleared her throat with the authority of someone who had made eavesdropping on household irregularities a professional necessity. "If it assists your investigation, Lord Peter," she said with obvious reluctance, "there were additional irregularities during Mr. Hawker's residence that I had not previously mentioned. Items displaced from their customary positions, doors discovered unlocked that should have been secured, and, most peculiarly, the appearance of candle wax in locations where illumination is never required." "Candle wax?" Wimsey's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "How delightfully atmospheric. What sort of locations, Miss Morley?" "The bell chamber itself, for one. Fresh black wax pooled on the stone floor, and in the manuscript storage room, similar drippings beneath one of the display cases, as though someone had been conducting examinations by candlelight rather than using the electric torches we provided." "Black wax," Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. "The same theatrical sensibility that produced our mechanical campanologist, I suspect. Someone with a decided taste for Gothic atmosphere, or perhaps someone attempting to create such atmosphere for reasons of their own." At this moment, Julian Venn, who had been maintaining his pose of languid detachment with decreasing success, made a sound that might have been suppressed laughter or barely contained anxiety. "Uncle Felix," he said with forced lightness, "your scholarly paradise appears to have attracted rather more drama than medieval manuscripts typically inspire. Though I suppose there's a certain poetic justice in discovering that your black hours have been attended by actual midnight conspiracies." Inspector Grayson's attention sharpened like a blade finding its edge. "You seem remarkably well informed about midnight activities, Mr. Venn. Perhaps you'd care to elaborate on your knowledge of these conspiracies?" The question struck Julian with visible force, and for the first time that evening, his carefully cultivated air of aesthetic superiority faltered completely. "I merely meant, that is to say, the whole business has such a theatrical quality, like something from a Gothic romance rather than real life." "Real life," Grayson observed grimly, "has an unfortunate tendency toward Gothic complications when valuable objects and desperate people occupy the same vicinity. Speaking of which, Mr. Venn, I believe you are acquainted with the late Thomas Blackwood." Julian's composure cracked further, revealing something that might have been genuine alarm beneath his polished exterior. "We had business dealings, artistic matters, nothing that could possibly relate to his unfortunate demise. Business dealings involving a debt of £500, according to Mr. Blackwood's ledgers," Grayson continued with relentless precision. "A sum that was due for repayment last week, shortly before his death under what the coroner termed ambiguous circumstances." The accusation hung in the library air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Mrs. Venn placed a hand to her throat, her sapphire brooch catching the lamplight, while Spedwell appeared to be calculating the distance to the nearest exit with the desperate intensity of a trapped animal. Julian's mask of aesthetic superiority finally shattered entirely, revealing a young man whose financial desperation had clearly driven him into waters far deeper than he had initially intended to navigate. Blackwood was a usurer, he said with sudden venom, a vulture who preyed on collectors with more passion than capital. He knew I needed funds for my own acquisitions, a series of illuminated bestiaries that would have established my reputation as a serious scholar. He promised reasonable terms, then increased them arbitrarily, threatened to expose my difficulties to Uncle Felix. A rather compelling motive for silencing a blackmailer, Grayson observed, and this notebook entry referring to Julian's folly, a dangerous game. What sort of game were you playing with Mr. Blackwood? Julian threw his hands up in a gesture that combined frustration with genuine fear. He was obsessed with the idea of a second Black Hours manuscript, convinced the Fairfax Mortimer estate had contained 2 examples rather than 1. He spent months trying to locate it, developing increasingly elaborate theories about hidden messages and coded signals. He believed the Abbey's bell was somehow connected to the missing manuscript's location. Wimsey, who had been examining the mechanical device with absorbed attention, looked up with sudden interest. A second Black Hours. How delightfully multiplicative. And Mr. Blackwood believed this hypothetical twin was concealed somewhere within Graydon Abbey itself. He was convinced of it, Julian replied with obvious reluctance. Said the irregular bell tolling was a form of communication, that the manuscript was singing its location to those with sufficient knowledge to interpret the signals. Complete madness, of course, but he was obsessed with the idea. Madness, Wimsey repeated thoughtfully, or perhaps a more practical form of misdirection. Tell me, Mr. Venn, during your London sojourn last week, the symposium on Romanesque architecture you mentioned, were you able to account for your whereabouts at precisely 2:10 and 4:30 in the afternoon, and again at midnight on the days our bell was most active? The question struck with surgical precision. Julian's mouth opened, then closed as the implications became clear. He had alibis for being in London, certainly, but could those witnesses account for brief absences, quick journeys, clandestine visits to Graydon Abbey during the precise windows when the bell had tolled its mysterious summons? Before Julian could formulate a response, the telephone in the morning room began to ring, not the usual domestic summons, but a deliberate pattern of brief rings, separated by measured silences. 2 rings, pause, 7 rings, pause, 2 rings again. The sound carried through the Abbey's stone corridors with crystalline clarity, reaching them in the library as though the instrument were in the same room. Signal calls, Wimsey observed with quiet satisfaction. Our conductor is summoning his orchestra for what I suspect may prove to be the final performance. The question becomes, ladies and gentlemen, whether we shall answer this summons, or whether we shall allow the evening's entertainment to proceed without our immediate participation. As the telephone fell silent, leaving behind an expectant hush, Wimsey reflected that the game was approaching its most delicate phase. The obvious solution, Julian as desperate debtor turned murderer, felt too convenient, too neatly packaged for a mystery that had begun with such elaborate theatrical flourishes. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create the appearance of supernatural intervention, and experience had taught him that such elaborate misdirection usually concealed motives far more complex than simple financial desperation. In the display case, the Black Hours lay open beneath its protective glass, its golden illuminations seeming to pulse with their own inner light, while somewhere in the Abbey's ancient stones, the shadows gathered with the patience of centuries and the urgency of approaching revelation. The telephone's coded summons faded into the Abbey's expectant silence, leaving behind a tension that seemed to vibrate through the ancient stones like the echo of some primordial bell. Wimsey replaced the receiver with characteristic deliberation, his pale eyes reflecting the sort of quiet satisfaction that typically preceded his most devastating observations. "Lords," he murmured, as though tasting the word for hidden flavors. "How delightfully ecclesiastical. Our correspondent possesses either a theological education or access to a rather comprehensive prayer book. Inspector, might I suggest we trace this call with appropriate haste? Though I suspect our mysterious campanologist has already departed the scene with the efficiency of someone well versed in railway timetables." Inspector Grayson was already summoning the exchange with the staccato authority of a man who refused to be managed by Gothic theatricality. The operator's response was gratifyingly prompt. The call had originated from the public telephone box near the post office, lasting precisely 8 seconds, and the caller had disconnected the moment after speaking that single word. "Sergeant Wilkes is dispatched to secure the area," Grayson reported, replacing the receiver with evident satisfaction. "Though if our caller possesses any sense of self-preservation, he'll be halfway to the next county by now." "Or sitting in our very midst," Wimsey observed with deceptive mildness, his gaze taking inventory of the assembled company with renewed interest. "The beauty of a theatrical misdirection, Inspector, lies not in the complexity of the illusion, but in the audacity of its execution. Consider the timing, a telephone call that draws our attention to external threats while internal machinations proceed unobserved." Julian Venn, whose carefully cultivated air of aesthetic detachment had been showing increasing strain throughout the evening's revelations, shifted uncomfortably under Wimsey's scrutiny. "Surely you don't suspect that one of us, that someone in this very room—" "I suspect everyone and no one," Wimsey replied pleasantly. "It's a failing of mine, this tendency to distribute suspicion with democratic impartiality. However, I confess myself particularly curious about your recent scholarly activities, Mr. Venn. This symposium on Romanesque architecture in London, a fascinating subject, I'm sure. Might I inquire about the specific sessions you attended?" The question struck Julian with visible force, his composure cracking to reveal something that might have been genuine alarm beneath his polished exterior. "The symposium was a matter of public record, Lord Peter. My attendance was noted, my papers presented." "Indeed," Wimsey agreed with characteristic urbanity. "Though public records, like parish registers, sometimes reveal more by their omissions than their inclusions. Bunter, would you be so good as to consult our railway guide? I find myself curious about the express service between London and Graydon Holt, particularly the scheduling of afternoon departures." Bunter materialized with a Bradshaw's guide that seemed to appear from the very air, his finger tracing the relevant timetables with methodical precision. "The afternoon express from Paddington arrives at Graydon Holt at 1:45, my lord, with a return service departing at 2:30. The evening service arrives at 3:55 and departs again at 4:45. "Fascinating," Wimsey murmured, producing his pocket watch with ceremonial precision. "A round journey from London, inclusive of a brief excursion to ring bells and whisper liturgical hours, would require approximately 3 hours, assuming, of course, that one possessed both the necessary railway connections and an intimate knowledge of the Abbey's acoustic properties." The implications settled over the library like a shroud. Julian's face had gone several shades paler, while Mrs. Venn's elegant fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her sapphire brooch. Spedwell clutched his briefcase with the desperate intensity of a drowning man grasping driftwood. "You're suggesting," Julian said with forced lightness, "that someone has been commuting from London specifically to engage in campanological mischief? That seems rather elaborate." "Elaborate, yes," Wimsey agreed, "but not impossible. Particularly if the bell ringing served some purpose beyond mere atmospheric enhancement. Mr. Blackwood, according to the inspector's investigations, was maintaining detailed records of these tolling patterns. One might infer that he was expecting them, that they constituted some form of communication or signal." Inspector Grayson consulted his notebook with grim efficiency. "Blackwood's telephone logs show calls placed to this abbey at precisely the times recorded for the bell's irregular behavior. Someone was coordinating these performances, Lord Peter. The question becomes who and why. And whether," Wimsey added thoughtfully. "Our late Mr. Blackwood's sudden demise was connected to his knowledge of these signals. Dr. Pennington, you mentioned that his death was ambiguous. No clear cause. Yet a healthy man of 35 doesn't simply expire without reason." Dr. Pennington's weathered features reflected professional uncertainty. Blackwood was something of a hypochondriac, always convinced he was succumbing to exotic ailments. He had particular anxieties about handling old manuscripts, claimed certain pigments and inks could affect one's constitution. His final collapse was remarkably sudden. A violent tremor, then simply stopped breathing, as if his heart gave up without warning. A violent tremor, Wimsey repeated, his attention now focused on the black hours in its display case. And did he, by any chance, suffer from known sensitivities to metallic compounds, or perhaps unusual reactions to substances commonly found in medieval illumination? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Miss Morley, who had been maintaining her competent composure throughout the evening's revelations, cleared her throat with obvious reluctance. "If it assists your investigation, Lord Peter, Mr. Blackwood did mention experiencing unusual sensations when handling certain manuscripts. Dizziness, palpitations, what he described as spectral chills. He insisted on wearing gloves and using special conservation techniques, claimed that some medieval pigments retained dangerous properties." "Dangerous properties," Wimsey mused, approaching the display case with renewed interest. His jeweler's loupe caught the lamplight as he examined the manuscript's edges, paying particular attention to the areas where pages had been removed. "Bunter, the samples you collected from our mechanical apparatus, have them analyzed for metallic residues, and examine these vellum fragments for any unusual chemical traces." As Bunter set about his methodical work, Wimsey continued his examination of the assembled company. Each person's reaction to the evening's developments had revealed layers of knowledge they had not previously disclosed. Julian's obvious nervousness about his London alibi, Mrs. Venn's subtle familiarity with manuscript authentication, Spedwell's desperate clutching of his briefcase, all suggested secrets that extended far beyond simple scholarly interest. "The beauty of our mystery," Wimsey observed with quiet satisfaction, "lies not in its supernatural trappings, but in its very human motivations. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create the appearance of Gothic intervention, while pursuing goals that are entirely practical. The question becomes whether we're dealing with fraud, blackmail, or something considerably more sinister." The chapel bell began to toll again, not the mechanical summons they had traced to its wire origins, but the measured bronze voice of genuine ceremony. 7 strokes, a pause, then 7 again, as though the abbey itself were keeping time with some ancient and inexorable rhythm. In that solemn tolling, the assembled company heard the sound of approaching revelation, of secrets that could no longer be concealed, alibis that would not bear scrutiny, and motives that would soon be exposed to the pitiless light of logical investigation. The game, as Wimsey was increasingly fond of observing, was approaching its most delicate and dangerous phase. And in the display case, the black hours lay open beneath its protective glass, its golden illuminations seeming to pulse with their own inner light, while somewhere in the abbey's ancient stones, the shadows gathered with the patience of centuries and the urgency of approaching truth. The genuine tolling of the chapel bell died away into the long library's expectant silence, leaving behind an atmosphere charged with unspoken revelations. Wimsey remained motionless beside the display case, his pale eyes reflecting the sort of quiet satisfaction that typically preceded his most devastating observations, while Bunter completed his methodical examination of the collected samples with the reverent precision of a priest handling sacred relics. "Most illuminating, my lord," Bunter reported, producing a series of small vials from his examination kit. The lamp-black traces from both the bell rope and the manuscript case are identical in composition, fine carbon soot derived from burnt oil, consistent with medieval lamp-making techniques. The silver particles, however, present a more intriguing profile. He held one vial to the lamplight, where metallic flakes caught the glow like captured starlight. "Not silver paint, my lord, but genuine leaf, exceedingly thin, applied to vellum and subsequently scraped away. The pattern suggests deliberate removal rather than natural deterioration. Deliberate removal, Wimsey mused, approaching the mechanical contrivance they had discovered in the wall paneling. Rather like our campanological engineer's approach to ecclesiastical music, Bunter observed this silk loop more closely. I believe our phantom bell ringer possessed a taste for comfort as well as concealment. Upon closer examination, the silk thread revealed itself to be part of an even more ingenious mechanism than they had initially suspected. The loop was attached to a longer cord that ran beneath the carpet to a precise point near the reading chair, a position that would allow someone to operate the bell device with their foot while appearing to be absorbed in scholarly contemplation. Foot control, Wimsey observed, with evident appreciation for the engineering. One might toll the bell while simultaneously consulting a concordance of Aquinas. Bunter, would you be so good as to demonstrate? Bunter positioned himself in the chair with episcopal dignity and, extending one polished shoe, slipped his toe through the silk loop. With the slightest pressure, the mechanism responded. A muffled toll echoed from the chapel, followed by the soft whisper of the spring mechanism resetting itself. Ingenious and remarkably lazy, Mrs. Venn observed, though her voice carried a note of strain that suggested the evening's revelations were taking their toll on her elegant composure. One need hardly be athletic to be diabolical. One need only be domestic, Wimsey replied pleasantly. Criminal contrivances are merely household conveniences misapplied, though I confess myself curious about the scientific properties of our medieval treasure. Dr. Pennington, you mentioned Mr. Blackwood's particular anxieties about manuscript pigments. Did he ever specify which substances provoked his spectral chills? Dr. Pennington's weathered features reflected professional concern. He was obsessed with the potential toxicity of certain medieval compounds, particularly the metallic pigments used in illumination. Vermilion, lead white, and especially the arsenical yellows, sometimes employed in conjunction with lampblack. He claimed that prolonged exposure to such materials could affect one's constitution, cause tremors, palpitations. Arsenical compounds, Wimsey repeated thoughtfully, his gaze returning to the vellum fragments. How delightfully medieval. The ancients had such a robust approach to chemistry, effectiveness first, safety a distant consideration. Bunter, these fragments from both the Colonel's envelope and Mr. Blackwood's effects, do they show evidence of such robust medieval chemistry? Bunter's examination was characteristically thorough. Indeed, my lord, spectroscopic analysis reveals significant concentrations of arsenic sulfide, orpiment, mixed with the lamp black in unusually thick applications. The concentrations are well beyond what would be required for purely artistic purposes. A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled company. Julian, who had been maintaining his pose of languid detachment with decreasing success, stepped forward with sudden interest. You're suggesting that someone deliberately created manuscript fragments with toxic concentrations of arsenic? But surely that would be detectable. Detectable to whom? Wimsey interrupted gently. Mr. Blackwood was a collector, not a chemist. His hypochondria would predispose him to attribute any ill effects to his own nervous constitution rather than external toxins. And the symptoms, tremors, cardiac irregularities, respiratory distress, could easily be dismissed as the natural consequence of handling ancient materials. Inspector Grayson looked up from his notebook with grim understanding. A method that would leave no obvious trace of conventional poisoning appear as natural death in a man known for his nervous disposition and require intimate knowledge of the victim's collecting habits. At that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, measured, deliberate, as though someone were walking with careful attention to the ancient flagstone's irregular surfaces. Rook appeared in the doorway with his customary silent efficiency, but his weathered features bore an expression of unusual concern. "Begging your pardon, Dr. Venn," he said in his measured baritone, "but Sergeant Wilkes has returned from the village with rather disturbing intelligence. The public telephone box shows signs of recent use, bicycle oil on the door handle, and this was discovered on the floor. He produced a small object wrapped in tissue paper, another fragment of black vellum bearing silver lettering, but with edges that showed fresh cuts as though recently separated from a larger work. The silver remained bright and unfaded, lacking the patina of genuine age. "Freshly prepared," Wimsey observed with quiet satisfaction. Our mysterious correspondent continues his scholarly activities. The question becomes whether this represents a warning, a challenge, or perhaps an invitation to some final performance. Miss Morley, whose competent features had been showing increasing strain throughout the evening's revelations, cleared her throat with obvious reluctance. "If it assists your investigation, Lord Peter, there is something else I had not previously mentioned. During Mr. Hawker's residence, I discovered traces of an unusual wax in locations where candles are never used. The bell chamber, the manuscript storage room. Black beeswax, but mixed with something that burned with a particularly acrid odor." "Black wax," Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. "The same theatrical sensibility that produced our mechanical campanologist. Someone with a decided taste for Gothic atmosphere, or perhaps someone creating such atmosphere for reasons of their own." Spedwell, who had been hovering near the doorway with increasing agitation throughout these revelations, made a sound that might have been suppressed laughter or barely contained anxiety. His briefcase slipped from nerveless fingers, spilling correspondence across the flagstones. Papers that Wimsey noted with sharp interest bore the letterheads of several prominent collectors. "Restoration supplies," Spedwell said quickly, kneeling to gather the scattered documents. "Perfectly legitimate materials for manuscript conservation." "Perfectly legitimate," Wimsey agreed pleasantly, though his pale eyes had sharpened with predatory interest, though one might wonder why a dealer in antiquarian books requires such specialized knowledge of medieval chemistry. Unless, of course, his business extends beyond mere authentication into the rather more creative realm of enhancement. Before Spedwell could respond, the chapel bell began its familiar sequence once more. Not the mechanical tolling they had traced to its ingenious origins, but the genuine bronze voice of ecclesiastical ceremony. 7 strokes, measured and deliberate, as though the abbey itself were keeping time with some ancient and inexorable rhythm. But this time, Wimsey was watching the assembled company with the focused attention of a naturalist observing specimens under glass. And in that watching, he began to discern the first faint outlines of a pattern that extended far beyond simple manuscript forgery. A pattern that suggested motives more complex and considerably more dangerous than anything yet revealed. "The game," he murmured with characteristic urbanity, "grows more interesting by the moment. For it appears we are not merely hunting a missing manuscript, but pursuing a meticulously concealed murderer whose weapon was knowledge itself, and whose motive runs deeper than mere pounds sterling." As the bell's bronze voice faded into the abbey's expectant silence, the shadows in the long library seemed to gather with renewed purpose, while somewhere in the ancient stones the truth waited with the patience of centuries and the urgency of approaching revelation. The scattered correspondence from Spedwell's briefcase lay across the flagstones like fallen leaves bearing witness to secrets, and Wimsey knelt with characteristic deliberation, his pale eyes scanning each document with the focused attention of a scholar examining illuminated manuscripts. The letterheads read like a directory of England's most distinguished collectors, while the invoices revealed a pattern of transactions that extended far beyond simple authentication. "Lord Pemberton, Sir Marcus Whitley, the Countess of Ashford," he murmured with quiet satisfaction. "A rather distinguished clientele, Mr. Spedwell, and all recent purchasers of what your correspondence terms enhanced medieval materials." How delightfully euphemistic. But it was Bunter who made the observation that transformed scattered papers into damning evidence. "My lord, observe the typewriter characteristics on these documents. The E has lost the tip of its serif, leaving a distinctive notch, and the O rides slightly high on the line." Wimsey's eyebrows rose with genuine appreciation. Ah, Bunter, the mechanical signatures that betray their authors. He produced his jeweler's loupe, examining first Hawker's letter of application, then one of Spedwell's invoices. Identical typography, Inspector. Mr. Hawker's credentials appear to have been composed on the same machine that produced Mr. Spedwell's commercial correspondence. Spedwell's composure cracked entirely, revealing beneath his nervous exterior a man whose commercial instincts had led him into waters far deeper than he had initially intended to navigate. I merely provided references for a competent conservator, he protested with desperate precision. It's customary in the trade to advance a man with skilled hands over ostentatious degrees. Skilled hands, indeed, Wimsey observed, examining the chemical invoices with renewed interest, including skills in the preparation of arsenical compounds. Your inventory, Mr. Spedwell, seems unusually robust in its provision of orpiment. Arsenic trisulfide, for those unfamiliar with medieval pigmentation. Dr. Pennington, the toxicological properties. Dr. Pennington's weathered features reflected professional concern. Highly toxic. Absorbed through skin contact or inhaled as dust, it causes tremors, cardiac irregularities, respiratory failure. Historically used in illumination, but in these concentrations, he examined the invoice more closely. This quantity would be sufficient to poison dozens of manuscripts, or to create the appearance of natural death in a collector known for his nervous constitution, Wimsey added thoughtfully. His attention shifted to Miss Morley, whose earlier testimony about candle wax had assumed new significance. Miss Morley, you mentioned finding black wax with a particularly acrid odor in locations where candles are never used. Might you describe this odor more precisely? Miss Morley's competent features showed the strain of unwilling recollection. Chemical, Lord Peter. Not like ordinary beeswax at all. It smelled of burning metal, perhaps, or heated minerals, and it was sticky, almost tar-like in consistency. Black wax mixed with orpiment, Wimsey mused, his gaze moving to Mrs. Venn with renewed interest. A substance that, when melted and applied to vellum, would create the appearance of authentic medieval pigmentation while delivering a lethal dose of arsenic to anyone handling the treated material. Tell me, Mrs. Venn, your background in conservation at the Sorbonne, did it include practical training in medieval chemistry? The question struck with surgical precision. Mrs. Venn's hand moved instinctively to her sapphire brooch, and Wimsey noted again the faint, dark smudge along the edge of her glove. Not merely lampblack from touching the display case, but something more complex, more deliberately applied. I studied conservation techniques extensively, she replied with forced composure. The preparation of period-appropriate materials, the analysis of authentic pigments, the methods used by medieval scribes. It was fascinating work. Fascinating and, one suspects, remarkably profitable when applied creatively, Wimsey observed with deceptive mildness. He produced the silk thread Bunter had found on the bell mechanism, holding it to the lamplight. Fine black silk, the sort used in delicate binding work, the sort that might cling to one's gloves after preparing toxic manuscript fragments with meticulous care. The accusation hung in the library air like incense, heavy with implication. Dr. Venn looked from his wife to his nephew with the expression of a man watching his ordered world dissolve into chaos, while Inspector Grayson stepped forward with the measured tread of authority, recognizing criminal enterprise. The enhanced manuscripts were never intended as mere forgeries, Mrs. Venn said with sudden dignity, as though the relief of discovery had liberated her from years of careful concealment. They were demonstrations of authentic medieval techniques created to show how the original scribes would have completed damaged works. The fact that collectors chose to value them as genuine antiquities was an unexpected development. An unexpected development that proved remarkably lucrative, Wimsey observed, until Mr. Blackwood discovered your methods and threatened exposure unless you shared the profits. a rather conventional form of blackmail disguised as scholarly collaboration. Mrs. Venn's elegant mask finally cracked to reveal something that might have been genuine anguish beneath her polished exterior. Thomas was impossible to reason with. He demanded not just money, but partnership, wanted me to create an entire series of discovered manuscripts for his collection. When I refused, he threatened to destroy my reputation, expose my work as fraud rather than scholarship. So you provided him with a particularly toxic demonstration, Wimsey continued with relentless precision. Manuscript fragments prepared with arsenical concentrations sufficient to cause the symptoms he attributed to his nervous constitution. The bell signals coordinated the delivery, ensuring he would handle the fresh, most potent materials when their toxic properties were at peak effectiveness. The chapel bell began its familiar sequence, 7 strokes, measured and inexorable, as though the abbey itself were pronouncing judgment on the assembled company. In that solemn tolling, Mrs. Venn heard the sound of approaching justice, while Wimsey reflected that the mystery had finally revealed its underlying structure. Not supernatural intervention, but human ingenuity applied to the most ancient of motives, the preservation of reputation through the elimination of inconvenient witnesses. The irony, he observed with characteristic urbanity, is that your scholarship was indeed remarkable, Mrs. Venn. Your recreations of medieval techniques were masterful demonstrations of historical accuracy. The tragedy lies not in your abilities, but in your willingness to transform knowledge into a weapon, scholarship into murder. As Inspector Grayson stepped forward to make the necessary arrest, the shadows in the long library seemed to gather with renewed purpose, while somewhere in the ancient stones the truth waited with the patience of centuries and the finality of justice itself. The game, as Wimsey was increasingly fond of observing, had reached its inevitable and most satisfying conclusion. Inspector Grayson's hand had already moved toward his handcuffs when Wimsey raised a languid finger with the air of a man remembering to wind a particularly delicate clock. "If you please, Inspector, not quite yet. There remains a flaw in our tapestry, large enough to march a regiment through, and several loose threads that require proper knotting before we can pronounce our needlework complete." Mrs. Venn stood motionless, only the rapid pulse at her throat betraying the strain beneath her elegant composure, while the assembled company waited with the expectant silence of an audience at the moment before the final curtain. "You see," Wimsey continued with deceptive mildness, "while Mrs. Venn's confession explains the method admirably, it fails to account for certain practical difficulties. Mr. Blackwood's death occurred at his own residence, not here at the Abbey. The toxic fragments came to him properly wrapped and labeled, but by whose hand? And more tellingly, Mrs. Venn, you mentioned being in Paris during the relevant period. The Bibliothèque Nationale would have records of your research visits. Hotel registers would confirm your presence. How does one administer poison from several hundred miles distant?" Mrs. Venn's mask of resigned dignity flickered, revealing something that might have been calculation beneath her composed exterior. "I've explained my methods, Lord Peter. The preparation of the fragments, the enhancement of manuscripts." "Indeed you have," Wimsey agreed pleasantly. "But preparation and delivery are separate arts entirely. Bunter, would you examine that typewriter more closely? I believe we shall discover it bears the same mechanical signatures as both Mr. Hawker's credentials and Mr. Spedwell's commercial correspondence." Bunter's examination was swift and definitive. "The E lacks the tip of its serif, my lord, and the O rides high on the line. Most distinctively, the ribbon has been spliced with green silk thread, an unusual repair that appears on multiple documents. A single typewriter serving multiple correspondence," Wimsey observed with quiet satisfaction. "Rather like a single bell serving multiple purposes. Inspector, I believe we shall find that our campanological engineer, Mr. Hawker, has been considerably busier than his modest bicycle repairs would suggest." At that moment, as if summoned by their discussion, The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Not the measured tread of household staff, but the irregular gait of someone moving with obvious urgency. Rook appeared with a man in custody, thin, nervous, with ink-stained fingers and the apologetic demeanor of someone whose small deceptions had grown beyond his capacity to manage. Found him trying to retrieve something from the bell chamber, Inspector. Rook reported with grim satisfaction. Had this in his possession. He produced a small canvas bag containing vials of pigment, fine brushes, and most tellingly, a quantity of black wax mixed with metallic compounds. Inspector Grayson examined the captured figure with professional interest. "Mr. Hawker, I presume." The man nodded miserably. "I never meant for anyone to die," he said with the desperate honesty of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. Mrs. Venn said the concentrations were calculated for discomfort, not death. Blackwood was supposed to feel unwell, perhaps seek medical attention, not expire in his study from arsenical poisoning, Wimsey finished gently. Though I suspect Mrs. Venn's calculations were rather more precise than she led you to believe. Tell us about the delivery system, Mr. Hawker. How did the toxic fragments reach Mr. Blackwood's hands while their creator remained safely in Paris? Hawker's confession came in a torrent of nervous detail. The bell signals had indeed been coordinated, not merely to create atmospheric effects, but to synchronize the delivery of prepared materials. While Mrs. Venn maintained her scholarly alibi in Paris, Hawker had been following her precise instructions, preparing the arsenical fragments, aging them appropriately, and delivering them to Blackwood at precisely the moments when the collector's attention was focused on the Abbey's mysterious campanological activities. She planned everything, Hawker said with obvious relief at unburdening himself. The timing, the concentrations, even Blackwood's psychological state. She knew his hypochondria would make him attribute any symptoms to his own nervous constitution rather than external causes. And the bell mechanism served multiple purposes, Wimsey added thoughtfully. The wire contraption we discovered allowed for remote signaling, but the manipulation of the actual bell served to test acoustics, create plausible explanations for supernatural phenomena, and most importantly, to establish a pattern of mysterious activity that would focus Blackwood's attention while the real work proceeded unobserved. Mrs. Venn's elegant composure finally cracked entirely, revealing the calculating intelligence that had orchestrated the entire enterprise. "Thomas was destroying everything I had worked to build," she said with sudden venom, not just demanding partnership in the forgeries, but threatening to expose the entire authentication network. Years of scholarly work, reduced to common fraud in his vulgar hands. A network that extended far beyond Graydon Abbey, Inspector Grayson observed, consulting the telegrams that had arrived throughout the evening. Scotland Yard has discovered enhanced manuscripts in collections throughout England, each bearing traces of the same toxic compounds, each sold through Mr. Spedwell's firm. Spedwell, who had been clutching his briefcase throughout these revelations, finally surrendered it with the defeated air of a man whose commercial instincts had led him into waters far deeper than intended. The documents within revealed the scope of Mrs. Venn's enterprise, dozens of manuscripts enhanced with her medieval techniques, sold to collectors who valued authenticity above safety, each piece a potential weapon waiting for the right moment to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. "The tragedy," Wimsey observed with characteristic urbanity, "lies not in your considerable abilities, Mrs. Venn, but in your willingness to transform genuine scholarship into systematic murder. Your recreations of medieval techniques were indeed masterful. It's unfortunate they were employed in service of such thoroughly modern motives." As Inspector Grayson completed his interrupted arrest, the chapel bell tolled once more, not the mechanical summons they had traced to its ingenious origins, but the measured bronze voice of genuine ceremony. 7 strokes, as though the Abbey itself were pronouncing judgment on the assembled company. In that solemn tolling, Mrs. Venn heard the sound of her carefully constructed world dissolving into chaos, while Wimsey reflected that the mystery had finally revealed its complete structure. Not supernatural intervention, but human ingenuity applied to the transformation of knowledge into murder. Scholarship into systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses. The shadows in the long library gathered with renewed purpose as the principals were led away, while somewhere in the ancient stones, justice waited with the patience of centuries and the finality of truth itself. The game, as Wimsey was increasingly fond of observing, had reached its most satisfying and inevitable conclusion, though he suspected the morning would bring additional revelations as the full scope of the authentication network came to light. The immediate aftermath of the arrests settled over the long library with the peculiar quiet that follows the resolution of long-held tensions. Yet Wimsey remained motionless beside the display case, his pale eyes reflecting not satisfaction, but the sharper gleam of a mind detecting patterns yet incomplete. Inspector Grayson completed his preliminary notes with methodical precision, while Dr. Venn stood among the ruins of his scholarly world like a man surveying the wreckage of a lifetime's careful construction. A tidy resolution to an untidy business, Wimsey observed, with characteristic urbanity, though his tone carried undertones that suggested the evening's revelations were far from complete. Yet I confess myself troubled by certain architectural inconsistencies in our criminal edifice. Bunter, would you examine once more the mechanical contrivance we discovered? I find myself curious about the precision of its installation. Bunter's renewed examination revealed what casual observation had missed. The wire mechanism showed signs of having been disturbed and reset multiple times, with wear patterns suggesting months rather than weeks of operation. More tellingly, the craftsmanship displayed a level of expertise that seemed inconsistent with Hawker's admitted mechanical abilities. Professional installation, Bunter reported with quiet significance. The sort of work that requires intimate knowledge of the Abbey's construction, access to specialized tools, and considerable time for proper concealment. Miss Morley, who had been maintaining her competent composure throughout the evening's revelations, shifted almost imperceptibly at this observation, her fingers tightening on her ring of keys with the unconscious gesture of someone protecting territory long defended. Miss Morley, Wimsey said with deceptive gentleness, you mentioned earlier that the bell's irregularities began with Mr. Hawker's arrival. Yet Bunter's examination suggests this mechanism has been in place for considerably longer. Might I trouble you for a more comprehensive account of the Abbey's recent acoustic history? The question struck with surgical precision, and Miss Morley's mask of efficient competence finally showed the strain of secrets too long concealed. The Abbey has always been responsive to those who understand its history, she said with obvious reluctance. There have been guardians before Mr. Hawker, individuals who recognized the importance of protecting certain treasures from those who would exploit them. Guardians, Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. How delightfully medieval. And these treasures they protected, might they include items not currently displayed in Dr. Venn's collection? Before Miss Morley could respond, Julian Venn looked up from his chair with sudden, sharp attention. Uncle Felix, he said with the air of someone remembering a half-forgotten conversation, didn't you mention that the Fairfax Mortimer estate papers referenced multiple dark hours purchased in a single year? What if there were indeed 2 Black Hours manuscripts? Wimsey finished with quiet satisfaction. One displayed for scholarly appreciation, the other preserved by those who understood its true significance. Miss Morley, I believe the time has come for complete disclosure. The silence that followed carried the weight of centuries, broken only by the distant sound of the chapel bell beginning its familiar sequence, not the mechanical tolling they had traced to its ingenious origins, but the measured bronze voice of genuine ceremony. 7 strokes, as though the Abbey itself were keeping time with approaching revelation. Miss Morley straightened with the dignity of someone who had carried a burden too long in solitude. The colonel entrusted certain responsibilities to those he deemed worthy of the trust. Rook and myself, being Graydon born and bred, understanding the Abbey's true significance. Mrs. Venn's activities threatened more than mere scholarly reputation. They threatened the security of treasures that have been protected here for generations. And so you used her own methods against her, Wimsey observed with evident appreciation for the irony. The bell signals she employed for coordinating her criminal enterprise. You adapted for your own protective purposes. The mechanical apparatus Hawker installed, you modified to serve as an early warning system. Most ingeniously, you allowed her conspiracy to proceed under observation, gathering evidence while protecting the true treasure from discovery. Inspector Grayson, whose practical mind had been struggling with the evening's Gothic complications, seized upon this more concrete thread. You're saying Miss Morley was conducting surveillance of Mrs. Venn's criminal activities, that she was gathering evidence and ensuring that the genuine treasures remained secure, Wimsey confirmed. The irregularities in the bell's behavior, the mysterious sounds in the walls, even the appearance of candle wax in unusual locations, all part of an elaborate system designed to monitor and, when necessary, interfere with Mrs. Venn's operations. Miss Morley's confession came with the relief of someone finally able to unburden herself of secrets too long carried alone. The Colonel had indeed entrusted her with the protection of a second Black Hours manuscript, the original and more valuable of the pair, while allowing the lesser copy to enter the commercial market as a decoy. Her surveillance of Mrs. Venn's activities had been motivated not by criminal complicity, but by the need to ensure that the authentication network never discovered the existence of the true treasure. The bell mechanism served multiple purposes, she explained with obvious reluctance. It allowed me to monitor communications, to signal warnings when necessary, and most importantly, to create the impression of supernatural intervention that would discourage unwanted investigation. And when Mr. Blackwood's investigations grew too persistent, Wimsey added thoughtfully, you found yourself in the position of watching Mrs. Venn eliminate a threat to your own protective activities, a most uncomfortable coincidence of interests. As Miss Morley led them through the Abbey's corridors toward a concealed chamber that had remained hidden for decades, Wimsey reflected that the mystery had finally revealed its complete architecture, not merely a case of scholarly fraud and systematic murder, but a complex interweaving of criminal enterprise and protective guardianship, each side using similar methods for opposite purposes. The true Black Hours, when finally revealed in its hidden sanctuary, proved to be everything the displayed copy was not: older, more complete, bearing illuminations of such extraordinary beauty that even Inspector Grayson's practical sensibilities were moved to something approaching reverence. The Colonel's final joke, Miss Morley said with something that might have been affection for her deceased employer. He let the lesser treasure draw all the attention, all the greed, all the criminal interest, while the true masterpiece remained safe in the hands of those who valued preservation over profit. As they returned to the long library with its precious burden, the chapel bell tolled once more, not in warning or signal, but in what seemed like satisfaction, as though the Abbey itself approved of secrets finally brought to light and treasures properly acknowledged. The game, as Wimsey observed with characteristic satisfaction, had revealed layers of complexity that elevated it far above mere criminal investigation into something approaching moral philosophy, the eternal conflict between those who would exploit beauty for gain and those who would preserve it for posterity. The shadows in the long library gathered with renewed purpose as the night moved toward its conclusion, while somewhere in the ancient stones, truth waited with the patience of centuries and the promise of justice finally, completely served. The true Black Hours lay open beneath the library's lamplight like a revelation made manifest, its ancient illuminations seeming to pulse with inner fire that transformed mere vellum into something approaching the divine. Yet Wimsey remained motionless beside the display case, his pale eyes reflecting not satisfaction, but the sharper gleam of a mind detecting patterns yet incomplete. While the revelation of genuine treasures provides a rather charming medieval epilogue, he observed with characteristic precision, it merely sets the stage for the true drama, which is, I regret to say, entirely modern and considerably less romantic. We have established the weapon, arsenical pigments, specifically orpiment, disguised as authentic restoration materials. We have identified the victim, whose untimely demise was in fact meticulously orchestrated murder. And we have, I believe, identified the architect of this ingenious crime. His gaze settled upon Mrs. Venn with surgical precision. The true brilliance of your scheme, my dear lady, lay not merely in the choice of poison, but in its delivery and the elaborate theatricality designed to obscure its nature. You understood Mr. Blackwood's hypochondria, his fascination with the supernatural, his belief that ancient manuscripts harbored malevolent energies. These were not merely quirks. They were the very levers by which you engineered his destruction. Inspector Grayson stepped forward with methodical authority. The technical details, Lord Peter. Ah, the beautiful simplicity of it, Wimsey replied, approaching the mechanical contrivance they had discovered. Mrs. Venn's alibi was impeccable. Scholarly research in Paris, complete with documented presence at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Yet distance proved no impediment to a truly resourceful mind. She required an unwitting accomplice, someone whose technical skills could be harnessed without full comprehension of the ultimate design. Hawker flinched as Wimsey's attention turned to him. Mr. Hawker was instructed to enhance manuscript fragments with orpiment-laced lampblack, designed to appear authentic. These fragments were dispatched to Mr. Blackwood, who eagerly handled them, believing the spectral chills and tremors he experienced were manifestations of ancient power, not the insidious work of arsenic poisoning. But the coordination? Dr. Venn asked, his voice hollow with the weight of betrayal. The bells, Wimsey said with quiet satisfaction. Your wife transformed Graydon Abbey's ancient voice into a sophisticated communication system. The wire mechanism allowed precise, timed signals. Mr. Blackwood's telephone records show calls to the Abbey at 2:10, 4:30, and 7:15. Not Blackwood calling here, but Hawker signaling back, confirming receipt of fragments or reporting the victim's deteriorating condition. The bell became a macabre semaphore, transmitting messages of death across the countryside. Mrs. Venn's elegant composure finally cracked entirely, revealing beneath her polished exterior a woman whose scholarly pride had curdled into systematic murder. Thomas would have destroyed everything, she whispered, her voice carrying the venom of years of careful concealment. My reputation, my work, my entire academic standing. He was a vulgar, grasping man who deserved what he received for trying to exploit genuine scholarship. Even if that scholarship was itself elaborate fraud, Wimsey countered with relentless precision. The motive was preservation of reputation and lucrative business. Rather than face exposure, you chose elimination, using his own obsessions as instruments of destruction. As Inspector Grayson completed the necessary arrests, Dr. Pembroke from the British Museum stepped forward with institutional authority. The question becomes the fate of these protected treasures now that their existence is revealed. Miss Morley, whose burden of guardianship had finally been lifted, produced the Colonel's leather portfolio. The network he established extends throughout England, dozens of manuscripts and artifacts protected by individuals who value preservation over profit. We had hoped for institutional recognition while maintaining personal dedication. A most satisfactory arrangement, Wimsey observed as they prepared departure protocols. Crime exposed, treasures protected, justice served with appropriate attention to cultural preservation. Though I confess curiosity about the bell's final performance, remarkably well-timed for genuine ceremony rather than mechanical manipulation. Miss Morley's smile carried the first genuine warmth of the evening. Perhaps the Abbey itself approves of secrets properly revealed and treasures appropriately protected. As they gathered coats and prepared for departure, Julian approached his uncle with obvious reluctance. Uncle Felix, I shall make the debt right, all of it." Dr. Venn looked at his nephew with what he deserved. Not reproach, which would have hardened him, but weariness that softened. "We shall manage, Julian. Art, like marriage, is not improved by borrowing." At the door, Wimsey paused for final observations. "Say nothing of tonight's revelations beyond what justice requires," he advised Dr. Venn gently. "There are occasions when silence proves more classical than quotation. When dust settles, send word that the hours rest dull in their new home. Dullness is the finest life for a masterpiece." The chapel bell tolled once more as they departed. Not mechanical summons or criminal signal, but the measured bronze voice of genuine benediction. 7 clear strokes, as though the abbey itself pronounced blessing upon the night's work. In the motor car, as Bunter navigated the October darkness with characteristic competence, Wimsey reflected on the evening's revelations. "Bunter, remind me to write Parker about murder by scholarship. No improvement over bottle or blade. Also include particulars of the arsenic wax technique. It may prevent some earnest collector from dying for love of art." "Very good, my lord." They drove through the reasonable English countryside, where hedges maintained their ancient dignity and fields accepted rain with customary resignation. After a time, Wimsey observed, "Truth, like champagne, is best handled by the experienced. For the rest, there is tea, dull institutions, and the humble occupations of decent men." "It is to be hoped, my lord, that the bell will profit by the experience," Bunter suggested with the faintest assent. "So do we all," Wimsey replied, settling into his coat with satisfaction. After all, superstition is merely vulgar compliment paid to mystery. One prefers bells that confess to books that breathe poison. The truth proves generally less obliging, but considerably more instructive. As they disappeared into the night, Graydon Abbey settled into ancient rhythms, its stones breathing with accumulated centuries, while somewhere in hidden chambers, treasures waited with the patience of preservation and the promise of protection properly maintained. The game, as Lord Peter was fond of observing, had revealed itself to be far more than criminal investigation. It had become meditation on the eternal conflict between those who would exploit beauty and those who would preserve it, with justice ultimately served on all sides of that most ancient divide. The shadows gathered with satisfied purpose in the long library, while truth waited with the patience of centuries and the finality of justice completely, properly served. The grey morning light that filtered through the windows of Wimsey's London flat carried with it the sort of autumnal melancholy that makes even the most resolute optimist consider the merits of strong tea and stronger resolve. Bunter materialized with the post and a selection of telegrams that suggested the previous evening's revelations at Graydon Abbey had generated considerably more paperwork than mysteries typically required. "Inspector Grayson reports developments, my lord," Bunter observed, with the measured precision of a man announcing both good news and the necessity of dealing with it promptly. Mr. Spedwell attempted departure on the 7:35 from Graydon Holt, apprehended with a Gladstone bag containing black wax, a bottle labeled orpiment, and half a sheet of black-dyed vellum. His statement proves contradictory in several material particulars. "Contradiction," Wimsey murmured, buttering toast with absent-minded precision, "is merely the soul's attempt to tell multiple versions of the truth simultaneously, rather like a manuscript with palimpsest tendencies. Any word from Dr. Pennington regarding our late Mr. Blackwood's chemical education? Toxicological analysis confirms arsenical compounds beneath the deceased's fingernails and in fibers recovered from his gloves, my lord. Orpiment specifically, mixed with proteinaceous binding agent consistent with medieval adhesives. The concentration suggests prolonged exposure rather than single catastrophic dose." Wimsey's pale eyes sharpened with the satisfaction of a scholar discovering that his theoretical framework had survived practical testing. Prolonged exposure exactly as Mrs. Venn calculated. Death by scholarship, administered in carefully measured doses, disguised as authentic historical experience. Rather more sophisticated than the traditional dram in a wineglass, though considerably less sporting. At Scotland Yard, Parker received them with the patient expression of a man who had spent the early morning hours separating intemperate confessions from inconvenient facts. "Your Mrs. Venn maintains remarkable composure," he reported, consulting a folder thick with statements. "Admits to the manuscript enhancements, denies murderous intent. Claims she intended merely to cause discomfort sufficient to discourage Blackwood's blackmail attempts. Hawker's testimony? Considerably less composed, wept, confessed, attempted withdrawal of confession, then confessed again with additional details. He insists Mrs. Venn assured him the arsenical concentrations were calculated for mild symptoms only. Enough to convince Blackwood that handling ancient manuscripts carried genuine risks. And our musical Mr. Spedwell." Parker's expression grew grimmer. "Attempting to claim duress, though his commercial correspondence suggests enthusiastic participation. We found a torn letter in his wastepaper basket, typed on the same defective machine that produced Hawker's credentials. A single line remains. 'Lords, for tonight, the bell will make them attend.' Signed with an initial I." Wimsey smiled without warmth. How ecclesiastically precise of Isolde. The lady conducted her orchestra from Paris with admirable attention to liturgical timing, though I note she chose lauds for an evening performance. Either her theological education was incomplete, or she possessed a rather mordant sense of irony regarding the dawn of justice. "There's more," Parker continued. Spedwell's lodging revealed additional correspondence with collectors throughout England. The authentication network was considerably more extensive than initially suspected. Enhanced manuscripts bearing arsenical compounds have been sold to at least a dozen prominent collections over the past 2 years. The implications settled over the small office like morning fog. Wimsey reflected that they had uncovered not merely a single murder, but a systematic campaign of scholarly terrorism disguised as historical preservation. "The beautiful efficiency of it," he observed with grudging professional admiration. Each enhanced manuscript became a potential weapon, waiting for the right combination of collectors' enthusiasm and handling frequency to achieve its lethal purpose. Mrs. Venn transformed the entire antiquarian market into an elaborate murder weapon. They returned to Graydon Abbey under a sky that had achieved the particular grey perfection that makes English weather a form of moral instruction. In the long library, Dr. Venn looked older, but somehow more substantial, as though the removal of illusions had paradoxically strengthened his foundation. "The British Museum has taken custody of the true hours," he reported with the careful precision of a man rebuilding his world one fact at a time. "Miss Morley will remain as curator of the Colonel's remaining collection, which proves to contain several additional treasures of genuine significance. It appears his network of guardians was considerably more extensive than we initially suspected." Miss Morley, standing with her ring of keys like a heraldic device for fidelity, permitted herself what might, in another woman, have been called a smile. "The Colonel's final joke proves more elaborate than we knew, Lord Peter. That defective Latin inscription, Noli tangere librum in vigiliis, appears on every decoy label in collections throughout England. Anyone quoting it verbatim betrayed themselves as having learned their Latin from our own deliberately flawed tags." "Mrs. Venn quoted it?" Wimsey inquired with evident delight. "Repeatedly, as did Mr. Spedwell whenever he examined new acquisitions. They thought themselves learned, but were merely advertising their connection to our authentication network." Wimsey's laughter carried genuine appreciation for the Colonel's posthumous scholarship. A grammatical trap that caught every pretentious fish in the pond, rather more elegant than fingerprints and considerably more educational. As afternoon light slanted through the library's mullioned windows, transforming dust motes into golden manuscripts suspended in air, Wimsey reflected on the evening's final lessons. The mechanical contrivance had been removed from the wall, leaving only a small scar in the ancient paneling, a reminder that even the most elaborate deceptions left traces for those with sufficient patience to discover them. The irony, he observed to Bunter as they prepared for departure, lies in the fact that Mrs. Venn's scholarship was indeed remarkable. Her recreations of medieval techniques demonstrated genuine mastery of historical methods. The tragedy lies not in her abilities, but in her willingness to transform knowledge into a weapon. The chapel bell tolled as they departed, not the mechanical summons they had traced to its ingenious origins, but the measured bronze voice of genuine ceremony. 7 clear strokes, as though the abbey itself were pronouncing benediction upon the restoration of proper order. In the motor car, as Bunter navigated the darkening lanes with characteristic competence, Wimsey settled into reflective contemplation. The fascination with Gothic mystery, the allure of supernatural intervention, all so much atmospheric decoration for the rather more pedestrian crimes of greed and vanity. It is always so, Bunter. The human heart, in its darkest recesses, proves far more chilling than any spectre conjured from medieval shadows. Indeed, my lord, Bunter agreed with quiet satisfaction, though one might observe that justice, when properly administered, possesses its own form of poetic symmetry. Quite so, Wimsey replied, producing his cigarette case with ceremonial precision. Mrs. Venn sought to use scholarship as a weapon, only to discover that genuine scholarship, in the form of careful investigation and rational deduction, proved the most effective weapon against her, rather like being hoisted by one's own petard, though considerably more literary in execution. As London's lights began to appear through the gathering dusk, Wimsey reflected that their Gothic mystery had revealed itself to be entirely human in its motivations and methods. The game, as he was fond of observing, had provided both intellectual satisfaction and moral instruction, the two qualities that elevated detective work from mere puzzle-solving into something approaching art. "Tea, my lord?" Bunter inquired as they reached the familiar comfort of Piccadilly. "Tea, Bunter, and perhaps a sardine sandwich that has not been enhanced with medieval chemistry. One must maintain one's constitution for whatever delightful unraveling of human folly awaits us next." Thus concluded the affair of the Black Hours, with justice served, treasures protected, and the eternal human drama of knowledge and corruption properly catalogued for future reference. In Graydon Abbey, the bells resumed their honest Christian purpose, while somewhere in the archives of Scotland Yard, the case files accumulated the dust of completed mysteries and the satisfaction of truth finally, completely revealed. The immediate aftermath of the arrests settled over Graydon Abbey with the peculiar satisfaction that follows the proper resolutions of long-standing mysteries, yet several threads remained to be gathered into the neat conclusion that both justice and scholarship demanded. In the long library, where the display case stood empty of its dangerous treasure, Miss Morley approached Wimsey with the air of someone finally able to unburden herself of the last concealed secret. "There is one final matter, Lord Peter," she said, producing from her desk drawer a tissue-wrapped package. Rook discovered this in Mr. Hawker's tool chest behind a false panel he had constructed, the missing leaf from the Black Hours, removed during his supposed conservation work to serve as a template for the forgeries. Wimsey examined the vellum fragment with renewed interest, his jeweler's loupe revealing the telltale signs of its recent adventures. Silver leaf had been carefully scraped from several illuminated capitals, leaving faint traces of the metallic compounds that had ultimately betrayed Mrs. Venn's elaborate scheme. Most significantly, the edges showed the precise cuts that matched the gap in Dr. Venn's manuscript like pieces of an ancient puzzle finally reunited. "The beauty of genuine scholarship," Wimsey observed as Dr. Venn fitted the leaf back into its proper position with trembling hands, "lies in its capacity for restoration. Unlike criminal enterprise, which can only corrupt and destroy, true learning seeks always to make whole what has been broken." Dr. Venn looked up from his careful work with eyes that reflected both gratitude and hard-won wisdom. "I shall not ask you to admire my judgment, Lord Peter, only my fortune in possessing friends who valued preservation over profit. Miss Morley's vigilance saved not merely one treasure, but two." The revelation of the Colonel's final stratagem proved even more satisfying than the recovery of the missing leaf. Miss Morley, with something approaching pride in her departed employer's cunning, explained how the deliberately flawed Latin inscription had served as an elaborate trap for the unwary. "Noli tangere librum in vigilis," she recited with evident satisfaction. The Colonel sent identical labels bearing this grammatically incorrect warning to every decoy manuscript in his network. Anyone who quoted it verbatim revealed themselves as having learned their Latin from our deliberately flawed tags rather than genuine classical education. And Mrs. Venn quoted it repeatedly, Wimsey observed with delighted appreciation for the posthumous scholarship. In every letter to Spedwell, in her authentication reports, even in her academic correspondence. She thought it a charming medieval archaism. The Colonel thought otherwise. It was his way of ensuring that any scholar who trafficked in his decoys would eventually betray themselves through their own pretensions. The legal proceedings that followed unfolded with the measured precision of British justice at its most thorough. Mrs. Venn maintained her elegant composure throughout the trial, though Wimsey noted that her hands trembled slightly when the arsenical fragments were produced as evidence, the first genuine emotion she had displayed since her confession. The sentence, when delivered, carried the weight of both legal and moral judgment. Transportation for life, with the recommendation that her scholarly publications be withdrawn from circulation and her authentication certificates declared null and void. Hawker, whose nervous testimony provided the prosecution with its most damaging evidence, received a lesser sentence that acknowledged his unwitting participation while condemning his willful blindness. Spedwell faced charges that would effectively end his career in the antiquarian trade. A form of professional death that seemed peculiarly appropriate for a man who had trafficked in the literal death of collectors. The broader implications rippled through the antiquarian world like stones cast into still water. Collections throughout England underwent meticulous re-examination, each enhanced manuscript a potential silent killer requiring careful neutralization. Scotland Yard, under Parker's methodical direction, began the painstaking process of tracing the full extent of the toxic network, while the British Museum quietly absorbed the genuine treasures with the institutional discretion that had served it well through centuries of similar acquisitions. Julian Venn's redemption proved as satisfying as his uncle's recovery of scholarly dignity. The young man's financial difficulties, which had made him vulnerable to Blackwood's blackmail, were resolved through honest means, a modest position cataloguing municipal archives that would provide both income and the humbling experience of genuine scholarship. Perhaps, Dr. Venn observed with paternal satisfaction, he will learn that the true beauty of history lies not in its market value, but in its capacity to instruct those humble enough to listen. Miss Morley's appointment as official curator of the Colonel's collection represented more than mere administrative convenience. It was recognition of a form of guardianship that valued preservation over publicity, protection over profit. The network of hidden manuscripts would continue under her direction, their existence known to scholars but their locations protected from those who would exploit them. The Colonel's final joke, she explained to Wimsey as they stood once more in the long library, proves more elaborate than we initially suspected. His system of guardians extends throughout England, dozens of manuscripts and artifacts protected by individuals who understand that some treasures flourish only in careful concealment. The chapel bell, freed from its mechanical complications, resumed its honest Christian purpose with what seemed like audible relief. Rook, whose satisfaction bordered on the sublime, reported that the bronze voice now spoke cleanly, without the guilty hesitation that had marked its recent criminal employment. The wire mechanism had been removed, the hidden passages sealed, and the ancient stones allowed to breathe once more with their accumulated centuries of legitimate prayer and meditation. A week later, in his Piccadilly flat, where the London fog pressed against the windows like yellowed parchment, Wimsey reflected on the case's deeper implications, while Bunter polished Georgian silver with rhythmic precision. The affair had revealed not merely a particularly ingenious murder, but a fundamental corruption of the relationship between knowledge and power, the transformation of scholarship from preservation into destruction. "The irony, Bunter," he observed, examining a first edition of Dawn with reverent fingers, "lies in the fact that Mrs. Venn possessed genuine genius. Her understanding of medieval chemistry was remarkable, her recreation of historical techniques masterful. Had she applied that formidable intellect to honest scholarship, her name would have been revered. Instead, she chose to transform knowledge into a weapon, learning into murder." "A cautionary tale, my lord," Bunter agreed without missing a stroke of his polishing, regarding the importance of maintaining proper perspective on the relationship between scholarship and responsibility. Indeed, the Gothic whispers and supernatural suggestions that so captivated poor Blackwood dissolved under the cold light of reason, replaced by the all-too-human machinations of intellectual pride and desperate self-preservation. Yet perhaps that is the most valuable lesson of all, that the human heart, in its capacity for both creation and destruction, remains the most fascinating mystery of all. He rose and moved to the window, peering through the swirling fog that lent even the familiar streets an air of medieval mystery. The bell at Graydon Abbey, which began its tolling as a mechanism of deceit, now rings with the honest voice of history. The shadows that once concealed criminal enterprise now shelter legitimate treasures. And somewhere in the archives of scholarship, genuine learning continues its patient work of preservation and instruction. Retrieving his hat and gloves, with characteristic deliberation, Wimsey prepared for his evening constitutional. As the ancients observed, Bunter, nothing is more active than thought, for it travels over the whole universe. The tragedy lies not in thought itself, but in its corruption by motives unworthy of its power. Mrs. Venn's crime was not merely murder, but the prostitution of genuine learning to serve the basest human impulses. With a final adjustment of his monocle and a smile that combined satisfaction with anticipation of future mysteries, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped out into the London fog. Behind him, the polished silver caught the lamplight like captured stars, while somewhere in the great city beyond, human nature continued its eternal drama of wisdom and folly, knowledge and corruption, truth and the most elaborate deceptions that intellectual pride could devise. At Graydon Abbey, the ancient stones settled into their proper rhythms of prayer and preservation, while in hidden chambers throughout England, treasures waited with the patience of centuries and the promise of protection properly maintained. The game, as Wimsey was fond of observing, had concluded exactly as it should, with justice served, learning preserved, and the eternal human capacity for both creation and destruction properly catalogued for future reference. The chapel bell tolled the hour with bronze authority, marking another day's passage in the endless human drama of knowledge sought and wisdom earned, while somewhere in the shadows of legitimate scholarship, truth waited with the patience of centuries and the promise that genuine learning, properly pursued, would always triumph over its corruption. Thus ended the affair of the murder among the manuscripts, not with supernatural intervention, but with the triumph of reason over superstition, method over madness, and the patient work of genuine scholarship over the most elaborate criminal deceptions that human ingenuity could devise.